David Gordon Hall, my old friend. I wonder how many people actually know what the G stands for.
Not very many, because it was just David G. Hall for a long time.
But you used to use that on the radio, didn't you? For a while.
I never used the name Gordon. It's been David G. Hall since I started working with you at KFBK in Sacramento in the 80s. Yeah. He was a news director. I think the guy who hired you at that station, Norm Woodruff.
He didn't hire me.
Oh, okay.
He didn't want us there.
Oh, okay.
No, I liked Norm, and we got along with him. I got along with him well, but he did not want Bob Nathan and me there, the kind of act that we did, as opposed to the kind of radio station he thought we were supposed to be.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
But that was a long time ago, and I figured it out. I think between the two of us, even though you're a number of years younger than me, you and I together probably have almost 100 years in the radio business.
I bet we do. I have 44 years. I have, and
I got 53. So,
wow. That's great. Yeah, you're right. It's about 100 years.
Let's start there. The business is changing, and I think it's going away. Although the industry doesn't like to say that. They don't like to admit it, and they say, "Oh, there's more people listening to radio now than ever before." And I go, "Don't give me that." I mean, I'm still getting my paychecks from the industry, and I appreciate it. And I've loved my career, and I've enjoyed, most of it. And but I mean, the fact of the matter is the technology is expiring. It's making us, and I like to say that we're going to be the 21st century lamplighters. We just not in crying need anymore. But what I'm interested in is how I don't think podcasting is the final transition. Do you? Because podcasting, by and large, at this point, is not live. And it's that live and local aspect of radio that was always its strength.
Well, I think for people of our age, with all the years that we were just talking about, I think live and local we understand that live and local is important.
Yeah.
I think people my daughter's age, she's 21, senior, University of California. I don't think live and local means that. I don't think it means anything to her. I think it's just if she needs information,
because she doesn't have the experience of it.
Because she doesn't have the experience of it. That's exactly right. And, she grew up, my driving her to school and certainly listening to the radio every morning on the way to school, which I know is a great memory for her. And I know she appreciates it. So she certainly knows all about radio, and she understands radio basically paid for the house that she grew up in and is paying for the college that she is attending now. She understands it in that way. But I don't think, like live and local, if I were to ask her how important that is, I don't think it would even register with her. Because I think what's replacing live and local is on demand. What's replacing live and local is I want something, so I just go find it, I search it or whatever. I go find it and I consume it, view it, listen to it, read it, whatever. Yeah. And then I'm done and I go on to the next thing.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not something I'd thought about. But that's what makes you a great programmer. I want to explain to people
because I can see the death of the industry coming at us over the horizon. In that case, I'd rather not be a great programmer.
You're like a dentist. You're trying to work yourself out of a career, out of a profession. No, I want to explain for people who might be listening in or watching, and maybe people who have heard your name and don't know the background. That you started in radio. You were a teenager, right?
I was 12. Well, I started at KROI in Sacramento as a call screener when I was 12 years old. What happened was when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, I used to listen to that same station on this little clock radio I think it was a hand-me-down clock radio from my dad in Sacramento, California. I used to listen to you on the radio, as a matter of fact. I listened to these people named like Wonder Rabbit and, and I wanted to be on the radio. I was absolutely fascinated. And when I was 12, I was in the 7th grade at Catholic school. And I thought, if this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, what am I doing just sitting around doing nothing? And I'd never even seen a radio station. So I went down to that radio station where you worked and where I first heard you, KROI. Yeah. And I saw just for a tour, just to see what a radio station looked like. Because I had this big fantasy.
We were on Arden Way at the time.
No, it just moved to Old Sacramento. It was 1977 when I went there.
Okay.
So I went there and I saw that there were like, high school and college kids interning there, like ROP or whatever that program is called. And I was in the 7th grade. So I was like, I'm in high school. I might be in college. Would you care? And in those days, now with labor laws and, HR and all that stuff, there's no way a kid could do that today. In those days, they didn't care. They just said, yeah, sure, you can be an intern.
Somebody wants to do the gopher work for free. That's great.
Exactly. So, and it was a great job. I answered the request lines for the DJs. This is an extremely obsolete term that really shows our age in this business, but I would pull the carts for the DJs where I'd pull all the songs that they're going to play in the next hour and all their commercials.
Tape cartridges, little cartridges with tape. It was on an endless loop, and that would be the commercials, or eventually it became the songs. And I guess it was when you started too, but we were just actually playing records, not songs on tape. Anyway.
Yeah. So I would, sometimes if the DJ had to go to the bathroom or something, I would sit there in the room and watch the controls. And that was a huge thing at that age. But that's how I started. So I've been doing it ever since.
Huh?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was how I started. I've been doing that ever since.
And so from there, how did you want, now I'm going to make this progression rather quickly, but how did you move into, how did you wind up doing news radio?
Several years later, I was working at this little radio station in Monterey, Cannery Row in Monterey, which again was a fantastic experience because it was such a tiny little radio station. There were about 3 of us there. I had been a DJ. I was doing requests and dedications from 7 to midnight as a DJ. And the general manager came to me, which is a 5-hour shift. General manager came to me and said, I'm paying you to be full time. So I'm actually paying you for 8 hours a day and you're doing 5. So I need you to do something else. Why don't you do news in the afternoon? And I didn't want to do news. I just wanted to be a DJ, right? Yeah. So I started doing news in the afternoon. And then one day there was this huge blackout over the whole area, the whole region, because there's a big power plant on the Central Coast that went out, right? So we're all sitting there. We didn't have a generator or anything. We're all sitting there waiting for the lights to come back on so the radio station could go back on the air. And somebody goes, hey, aren't you the news guy? Like, shouldn't you be out there at the power plant gathering this story or something? And I was like, well, I got nothing else to do. I might as well. So I got in a car and I went out to the power plant and talked my way through the gate and, was there with the other reporters and I loved it. And really? From then I went back to that general manager and I said, I'll tell you what, instead of doing news and requests and dedications, I'll do the morning news. I will go cover news all day long, and then I will do the afternoon news. So I signed myself up for basically a 12-hour day, and I loved every minute of it. And that's how I made the transition. I don't
think this is how people get into any business anymore. Starting, just kind of learning a little bit here and there and fumbling your way in, and whoever's in charge going, yeah, okay, come on.
Yeah,
just gotten
I don't think that happens the same way anymore.
So what moved you into back to Sacramento?
I got fired, and
why? I didn't know.
Well, I got fired because I was homesick, and I used to call my mom all the time. I mean, this is like I was 18 years old when all this was happening. So I just graduated from high school, moved to Monterey, so I was 18 years old, and so I used to call my mom all the time, and I ran up the long distance bill. So I got fired. So I wrote to the stations in San Francisco, which I thought there's no way, they're going to hire me out of Monterey, this tiny little, station. And I wrote to the stations in Sacramento, KGNR, where you were working at the time, and KFBK, the big, 50,000 watt sleeping giant at that time. And the same news director that we were talking about a minute ago, who didn't want to hire you and gave me the middle initial of G as my air name. He said, look, I don't have anything. I don't have any opening at all, but if you want to send a tape. And I said, I can have it there in 3 hours. And I drove it there, and he was impressed. And he put me through my paces. He made me write a newscast. He made me record that newscast in a production room that I had never been in before, with a control board that was longer than the bed that I was sleeping in. Yeah. He brought in all these people from the newsroom to stand behind me to make me nervous while I recorded my newscast that I had just written at this board. So I went through all of these things.
He intentionally gave you?
It was intentional.
In the nervous aspect.
Yeah, totally. Because he wanted to see how I would be under fire. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, he wanted to see how I would be under fire. He wanted me to see what I would do, like in a breaking news situation where you're just doing your thing and you're doing the format, and then all of a sudden there's an earthquake or whatever, and you have to
people standing around watching and listening. We're talking about a guy named Norm Woodruff who had come to Sacramento from KCBS in San Francisco.
KCBS in San Francisco.
Okay, go ahead.
So after that, he asked me, after all of this, and he sent me out to go cover a story. I mean, it was like a day-long thing. He had me doing all these things. And all the time I'm thinking, he doesn't even have an opening. I don't know what he's doing, but I got nothing to lose. Okay. So end of the day, do the last thing that he has asked me to do. And he says, I have 2 questions for you. And I said, okay, first one, how many people in the United States Congress? And I thought, well, 553, of course, 453 in the House and 100 in the Senate. But that's such a simple question. If you're asking me, it must be a trick question. And so I started, second guessing myself. Well, does Puerto Rico have senators that I, didn't realize or, whatever? And I answered, and he said, okay. And the current governor of California, his name was George Deukmejian at the time, current governor of California, what did he do before he was governor? And I said, well, Attorney General, of course. But again, I'm thinking, why are you asking me these really basic questions? And then he said, you are the first person I have asked those 2 questions to who actually got them right, who's in the news business.
Wow.
I want to offer you a job. And by the time I walked out of there that same day, I had a job. And that's how I got to Sacramento. I started as a reporter. And I mean, that's how when, the whole news talk aspect of my career really took off.
Yeah. And that's about the time I met you. About 1985 is when I met you.
March of 85, as I recall.
Yeah. Right.
And this was happening. I was there with him in October of 1984. I started, I think the same week Rush did, because that was where Rush did his local, started doing his local show. Right. We were just a few days apart when we started. I ended up being the news anchor in his show, and he used to make fun of me mercilessly. The commie pinko news anchor, David G. Hall now with misinformation. David, it's your turn. It was like, that's what my intro was in his show, to do a newscast.
That was the lovable little fuzzball, Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
People don't understand, people still ask me about him, oh, you worked with him? How could you stand it? How could I stand it? He was a good friend. We really got along very well. He was a wonderful guy. And most people say, well, doesn't sound like a wonderful guy on the radio. I go, well, you know what? I suppose it was an acquired taste, but he developed at that radio station. He developed his shtick, his personality, his character, and he was really who he was in real life. He was ultra conservative guy, but and it's a key thing in radio. It's like you present yourself, but you do it bigger, right? Mm-hmm. It's projected. Mm-hmm. And that was Rush. So, and the other thing about him was, and I'm explaining now in case people watching go, did you guys work with Rush? The thing about Rush was, in person, you would never know that he had these strong and sometimes offensive opinions about things, because he was basically a wallflower in social settings. I had him over to my house for a couple of parties, and we used to go out once in a while. And he kept typically sat in a corner and was just quiet. Then somebody come over and talk to him, and he was very polite and gracious. I mean, the guy was from Missouri, and from a big name, upstanding family. Mm-hmm. So he was.
He came to my wedding. I got married in 1986, and my wife ran a bunch of women's health clinics in Northern California.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this is going to be really. But, I invited him, and he came. He was happy. I think he was happy to get the invitation. I think he was honored, or, whatever, to get the invitation. Right. And he came, and he ended up sitting at a table with all of these colleagues of my wife. And that was the table that was the life of the party at the reception. The laughing and just the noise coming from that table. Rush Limbaugh sitting there surrounded by, probably 8 women and nurse practitioners who worked in women's health clinics at that time. And that was the time where, now the National Organization for Women was a big thing, and abortion was a big issue, as it is still now, I guess. But And these health centers didn't necessarily do abortions, but they were certainly women's health centers.
And Rush Limbaugh was on the radio calling them feminazis.
Exactly. And so here he was sitting at a table with them for 2 hours. And I kind of expected him to, very politely come in and, maybe give us a gift and, hug my wife and shake my hand and congratulate us and then find his way out the door quietly when no one was looking. And he was there the entire time. He loved it. Yeah.
He came to our wedding too, 1988. As a matter of fact, and it was an outdoor wedding up in Nevada City, California, up in the foothills, the gold country outside of Sacramento. And we had horses and stuff. My wife came in on a beautiful a wagon pulled by horses, and I came in on a white horse, and my groomsmen were all riding horses and so forth. And we had put in the invitation that we were recommending Western attire. Well, Rush, he was, always wearing a suit and tie.
Yeah.
And that's how he showed up. But he did
Sansa pants.
Yeah, right. And somebody found a cowboy hat for him to wear. And he had a great time, and it was like, it was no easy task getting there. It was a long drive. So we were honored by his presence, and so were a lot of other people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the background where you and I got to know each other a little bit. I was impressed by you because of your natural gift for telling stories on the radio and in such a way as it was clear, you were concise, to the point, and you were well spoken, very articulate. You didn't fumble around. You didn't have to write a script, and you really loved what you were doing. So that was very cool. And
well, you were a great inspiration for that, because that's exactly how you are. Of course, you're describing yourself. And, I've seen you over the years tell and heard you tell so many stories on the radio, and they're never scripted. If they were scripted, I think it would make it worse for you. They're never scripted. They're always off the top of your head. You were actually very inspiring to me. And there's a moment that we had together that I'm sure you don't remember, but I certainly do. I was reporting live in your morning show one morning. It was the arrival of the Sacramento Kings. They had moved from Kansas City, wherever they came from. So
I remember that time.
Yeah. So it's like, this is the day, the actual day where the team came to town. The arena had been built and all this, and they came to town. I'm doing a live report, a live shot in your show as their buses are approaching the new arena. And I had this brain freeze. So I'm like in the middle of talking, and I just totally lost my train of thought and couldn't grab it. And so rather than umming and ahhing, I just froze. So on the radio, you hear me talking, then you hear, and I'm silent, I'm mute, right? So you say, oh, obviously, technical difficulty. We'll get back to David in a second. You go on to the other, whatever's next. And then you called me and you said, you okay? And I said, I'm so sorry. I just had a brain freeze. And you said, the thing to do when that happens is just change the subject and start talking about something else. So just talk about the weather. And the second you start talking about the weather, you'll remember where you were and just work your way back. It was great advice during like about 10 seconds during a commercial. And then we went right back to my report. And that was the cool thing about you, is that I don't think I've worked with in my whole career anyone else that would have handled that the way that you handled that. And of course, at the time, I was like, mortified that I froze up during the morning show and your show. And, and that was an amazing moment.
I don't remember that. The story that I like to tell from being on the air and working with pup reporters, I call anybody who was young, just starting out. You were my pup reporter. Was Brett Burkhardt. Brett Burkhardt. I know a lot of people a lot of radio people will watch and listen to this conversation with you, so they know who Brett Burkhardt is. He went on to from Sacramento. He went on to KGO and won so many awards for reporting that we always kidded him about having an Edward R. Murrow wing onto his house in the Bay Area. I mean, he just won every award that came back. I mean, he's a great reporter, and now he's at KCBS. But we were doing a live report with Brett one morning when he was very young and starting out, and it was one of the annual floods that we had in Northern California. It was every year, that. And he was out in Yolo County, I want to say up around Cache Creek, Woodland area, maybe a little bit farther north. I don't remember the exact location, of course, but he he was ready for the introduction, and I introduced him and I said, and now we're going to go out to Cache Creek, and KFBK's Brett Burkhart has a live report. And there was dead silence for about 4 seconds. And then Brett says, very dramatically, "That's the sound of a log floating by." And I interrupted. I said, "Excuse me, Brett, can we hear that again, please?" I'm pretty sure that's the first time I ever heard a sound of a log on a radio.
That's great.
So, as I remember, he just went ahead and did what I asked. He put the microphone down by the log again. But oh yeah, it was a wonderful time, and we all learned so much.
Yeah,
we learned from each other, And I just I wonder. Well, I can tell you for my own experience, and you've had much more experience than I have at radio stations, as you went on to Los Angeles, that people don't work that way anymore in this country. I think, at least, you tell me. There was that time when we used to all talk about radio all the time to each other. We talked about news. Or if we were disc jockeys, we talked about music, and we talked about the craft of radio, how to do this, what's the best way to do that, and all that. And it was really exciting, and it was a learning experience. And I got to Dallas 11 years ago.
Wow, it's been 11 years already.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There was none of that going on in the newsroom. And people just kind of come in and do their jobs. Everybody's polite. Everybody likes each other. Everybody gets along just fine. But there's no conversation about the business. There's no passion, apparently, about the business.
There's definitely less passion.
Pardon me?
There is definitely less passion now.
Why do you think that is?
Than there were. I think it's because of the way the business has been managed over the last 20 years. Since
large
radio companies, since radio started consolidating, it's not mom and pop anymore. It's big corporations. All those big corporations, of course, have a ton of debt, which they accrued acquiring all of these radio stations. And so, I think they're managed very differently than they were when we were at KFBK or, earlier in our careers now. But I will tell you this, maybe this will give you a glimmer of hope. First of all, my job is to do exactly what you just described. So I go around radio stations in the United States and actually now all over the world and help people, coach people, and help them be better. So, which is three things. It's finding their strengths and helping them just kind of stay in what they're best at, stay in their wheelhouses, the cliche would go. Trying to manage their weaknesses. So the things that they're terrible at, I try to get them to not do those things as much. Right. And then I share a lot of best practices where I say, hey, I heard this thing on NPR, or I heard this thing on this station, or in France, they're doing this thing that you might want to try. It seems like it'd be suited to you. So that my job is doing just what you described, and it's gone well. And I find people to be extremely receptive, probably for the very thing that you were just talking about, because they probably don't get a lot of good advice, and they don't get that learning experience, and they don't get that discussion, that passionate discussion that we used to have anywhere else in their building. And then I come along and it works very well. And I think they really soak it up.
They don't just look at you like some kind of nut.
Oh, they always do it first. Oh, Jesus Christ, another consultant, please. Oh.
Yeah.
And then we start talking, and then they go, "Oh, this is actually pretty helpful." Like they're surprised. And then I've had some really good, strong relationships, forged with these people that I've worked with over the years, and I've helped a lot of people become very successful, and so it all works out in the end. But it always starts with, "Oh, Jesus Christ, not another consultant."
Do you find I'm sorry. Do you find that you get better reception from people who are working in other countries than here in the U.S.?
No, it's the same everywhere.
Is it really?
Yeah. It's the same everywhere. It's part of it is, not another consultant. I'm going to come in with a list of things, or I'm cookie cutter. So this is what I did 25 years ago at KFI in Los Angeles. So this is what I need you to do today, which I don't, I don't work that way. But so they expect that. in other countries, what I come up against is that's all very interesting, but you don't understand. It's different here. This is not the United States. It's different here, you know? Yeah. And so that's something I always have to overcome. But what I was going to tell you is that I hopefully will give you a little bit of hope. In my travels, and in the United States, in my travels, going to stations, mostly big, but I have a couple of smaller ones too, I do find people at those stations that are passionate and that work like we used to work. There's a guy, the news director at WIBC in Indianapolis. His name is Chris Davis. He was in Mississippi, tiny little town in Mississippi, and they hired him at the station in Indy, which was a MS station at the time. He's the news director, but he loves reporting, and he's a pretty good anchor. So he is the fill-in anchor for everybody, the morning guy, the afternoon guy, the late night guy, whatever. Sure. And then when he has free time, he just goes out and covers stories. So he's the news director. And then if something's going on and he doesn't have someone to send, he just goes out in the car and does it himself. And he works incredibly long days, and he's very passionate about what he does, and he loves what he does, and he's always looking for feedback. And he's one of several people that I see and work with in this country where I go, okay, there are still people who are passionate, and you know, and the term 8-hour workday does not apply to them, or they do not apply that to themselves, is really the way to say it. Which is pretty cool. And it gives me hope seeing people like that.
I would guess, you may not know the answer to this, but I would guess that that's because like attracts like, and that's the kind of person you are. And your passion is contagious. The things that you have to share are they're thought-provoking. And you make people think about their own relationship to what you're talking about. I mean, it's hard to talk to you and get that, man, how much longer am I going to be here feeling, because, you know, you really listen and you do have a lot to say. And when you don't know the answer to something, you say that. Yeah. And it's very refreshing. Yeah. So, you went on to be a real big deal. You went down to Los Angeles, KFI. That was your first programming job, wasn't it?
My first programming job. Yeah. I was 22 when I left KFBK as news director and went down there as news director, and then became program. Maybe I was 23 when I became program director. Yeah. But yeah, that was my first programming job. Kind of a crazy place to have a first programming job.
Well, and not only that, but you, and I guess, George Oliva was the program director who took you down there, right? From Sacramento. George had been with us in Sacramento. I was supposed to go, but I couldn't get out of my contract. And I guess a number of people left KFBK to go down to KFI with George and you. I used to say
I think there were 5 of us all together.
I was going to say, they once kind of pretty much backed up the bus and emptied the radio station. But you guys, I don't know how much was you and how much was George. I guess George wasn't there all that long, was he?
No, he was there, I think, a year before I took over for him. So he hired me to be news director, and then a year later he left and I became program director.
And KFI became like the most successful news talk station in the country. You know, in a business sense, almost overnight. And you did some really, really innovative things. And I believe they are still, how long ago was that? That was 1980.
1991, I started as program director. Yeah. Or 1990, I guess I started as program director.
Okay. So we're talking.
That's a long time ago. It's 32 years ago.
Yeah. And I think they're still using your phrase, right? More stimulating talk radio.
Yeah.
And,
and some of the same people that I hired are still there. Like Bill Handel does the morning show. Yeah. He does a great morning show. He's still there. John and Ken, who do the afternoon show, those guys are still there. Which is
Where'd you find these people?
Bill Handel was already there doing a legal show on the weekend, Handel on the Law.
Right.
Listen to him do the show.
It's a great show.
He would tell people, look, I'm not supposed to give you this advice, but here you go anyway. You know, he would say things like that. He was very irreverent, and I love that. And we had a morning show that was not working very well, and you will know in those days, in the 80s and 90s, and you and Bob kind of had a version of this, but most morning shows on news talk stations were either just a solid news block, as we would call it, where it's just like an ongoing newscast for 3 hours, right? Or it would be a couple guys like you and Bob, mixing entertainment and news and some personality, and then doing news and, in that. And that's what KFI was up against at the time. And I wanted to do something completely different. So I had this guy on the weekend who's doing this legal show, and very irreverent and a bigger than life personality. And I thought, I got nothing to lose. What if I go with this guy in the morning and have him just do a talk show, which, excuse me, to that point, I don't think had really been done much in talk radio, to just do a talk show in the morning, right?
Drive, yeah.
So I put him on, and and he's still there 32 years later. So that's how that happened. And he's great, man. He has such a great personality, and he was absolutely great to work with and to develop that show in the first few years when we really got it going and when he really came to success.
You hired a bunch of other people. I'm going to not be able to remember all the names, but they were really new age kind of talk radio people. They weren't, in that day, the standard process was to talk about politics, kind of down the middle. People would lean one way or the other, but it wasn't the outrageous kind of rants and stuff that you hear these days. But you hired some people that had a lot to say, and I'm thinking of there's a guy. He's
Phil Hendry, maybe.
Well, I was going to ask you about Phil Hendry separately, but doggone it, I'm embarrassing because he's going to be watching this. He's a Facebook friend, and we are a mutual admiration society. Joe Crummy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he was great. I love Joe Crummy.
Yeah. Hi, Joe.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And you had Mother Love?
Yeah, George hired Mother Love.
Okay.
Actually, yeah. So the lineup that I inherited from George was pretty creative. Mother Love, a guy named Christopher Bartlett, an Australian guy. Joe was part of that. Tom Likas was part of that. He was doing the afternoon show.
Sure. Yeah.
And within a couple of years, when I got hired, general manager said to me, because, I'm like 22 years old, my first gig, first programming thing. General manager says, look, and we were like a one share of, we were like at the bottom of the ratings, right? Against KNX, which is one of the biggest all news stations in the country, and KBC, which was the original talk station and number one in the market and the top billing radio station in America. So we were like in the bottom of a canyon, and those were the walls of the canyon, those two stations. So we had no audience. And general manager said, look, I'm going to take a big chance hiring you to do this because you have no experience, et cetera. We feel like we have a good lineup and things have been, set in motion. And so you just need to maintain it. Don't make any changes. And within 2 years, I think the whole lineup had changed. And it wasn't like I just went through and cleaned house and got rid of them all. They all left for various reasons. Mother Love left to do a TV show, and Christopher Bartlett left. I don't remember why. And so, there were a couple of people where I ended up having to make a change and replace them. But for the most part, they just kind of went their own ways, and I was forced with replacing them. So we had this part of the lineup before I started was a psychologist or a psych show, a woman named Dr. Barbara DeAngelis. And we had a contract negotiation and it didn't go very well, and I needed to replace her. And I had this other person who had been working part-time named Dr. Laura Schlesinger. And I thought, well, I got Dr. Laura in my back pocket. And frankly, I think she might fit what we're trying to do here a little better and fit the format a little better of, being more outspoken and being more opinionated, because she certainly is opinionated.
She's not still on the air, is she?
She's on Sirius XM now.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yep. And then, as I said before, I had a morning show that was kind of falling apart. And so I went and got Bill Handel, and, so yeah, within a couple of years, the lineup ended up being pretty different. And it's mostly the lineup that's still there today with just a few changes.
The thought about Dr. Laura was always, and I've heard that a lot of people said this, and I have no idea. So I'll just ask you, was she really a doctor of any sort?
Of physiology.
Physiology.
Yeah.
So not psychology or psychiatry or any of that stuff.
No.
Okay. So it's like Dr. Jill Biden. She's a doctor of education.
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay. So tell me about Phil Hendry. Phil Hendry is a very well-known name, the most unique radio talent I have ever heard. Never met him. Always wanted to go watch him perform.
He's amazing to watch.
Didn't he do live audiences?
Yeah, he's done a couple or a few over the years. Yeah.
Explain his act, what he did, and how you came onto him.
Well,
I don't mean how you came onto him. I mean how you found him.
Hey, big boy. So he was working part-time at KFI when I took over. Right before I took over as program director, when George Oliver was still there, and he was doing a very straight talk show, topic, politics, opinion, calls, beating up calls, whatever. And George, actually, so right before I started, George fired him. And he went to, first, I think he sat on the beach, probably literally for a minute. And then he found himself at this little radio station in Ventura. And he started doing the same, kind of angry, not necessarily conservative, but very opinionated talk show. And he got no phone calls. And then one day, I don't know how many months into this he was, and he was getting pretty tired of the fact that nobody would call him. So one day he decides to be the phone call. So he called and was on the phone. And so he was himself, he was the host, and then he was a caller. And then he decided to have a guest. And his first guest,
he was just to clarify, he was talking to himself.
That's right.
Two separate people.
Right.
He was the host of the show talking to a caller who was also him. And
that's right.
He never, I mean, maybe in the beginning, you can help me with this. When he was on the air on KFI doing that later, he never made any secret of that. People didn't believe when he said, I guess I don't remember exactly how it was, but he never made any secret of the fact that he was doing these characters on the phone. But people believed them. People just bought into them. He made
them very believable. Yeah. He didn't script he still does it, I guess, to this day. He doesn't script any of it. It's all off the top of his head. So he's like 2 and sometimes 3 people at the same time. So now sometimes he's the host. Hey, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. Here's the phone number, blah, blah, blah. And then he's the guest, and he has a totally different voice. And he has like a cast of characters of regular guests that he has on. And then sometimes he's also the caller. So he'll be the host trying to, be the moderator. And then he's the increasingly crazy guest. And then he's the caller who's just incensed at the craziness that the guest is saying. And he's all 3. And so
he got so good at it, he could interrupt himself.
Right.
And the pacing was perfect.
That's right. He never lost his train of thought. He would mix
3 voices into one little tight piece of dialogue.
Yeah, a very fast dialogue. Yeah. And he does interrupt himself. I think that's the trick that makes it kind of work and feel so real, is the way that he interrupts himself. Because you could swear he's talking over himself, but of course, literally, he can't. He isn't. He can't be. So then he started doing these voices, and he started developing his characters. We hired him, the same company that owned KFI. We hired him to do the afternoon show in Miami, and then sold that radio station. And I asked that when the station be sold, that he be held back within the company to come work with me at KFI, which I didn't think they were going to do, because when a radio station, especially a talk radio station, is sold, the value of the station comes from the personalities. You can't not have the afternoon #1 personality and hold the price of the radio station. But they did that, and luckily for me, and they held him back, and he moved back to LA and came back to KFI and did the show in the evening for me for a few years, and then became syndicated by Premier Radio. And then when I left KFI, I actually went to Premier and at the same time that they syndicated him, and continued to work with him there.
It's a small business, isn't it, in that respect?
Yes, it is.
You and I met in 1985, and for a brief time there, I was your boss. And then so 20 years later, you were my boss in Los Angeles.
Yeah. It is funny how that works. KNX, when I first started, when I was like 12, 13, whatever, at KROI, that first radio station, somebody said, man, be nice to everybody, because you never know when somebody's going to be, and they were telling me at the time, we're going to be working for you someday. And so that's why we treat you with respect, because we know we're going to be working for you someday. And it does work that way.
It does work that way. For people who don't understand the perspective of your career, And I don't remember, you'll have to remind me how you got into consulting, because at one time in Los Angeles after KFI, you were working at KNX, KFWB, where I was working. And then you went over to KABC for a while. And now you are as you said, a consultant, but it's more than a programming consultant. You are widely considered to be the biggest programming brain in the world. And I know I've heard the term genius a lot about you going back many years, and I'm sure you probably would disavow that. But
I would.
The fact of the matter is, you've had an extremely successful career programming radio stations all over the world. Where are these countries that you're working with now?
Well, right now I'm working in Spain, France, Portugal, Greece, and then Peru, Colombia, Mexico, and then in the United States. But I've worked in New Zealand, I've worked in Poland, I've worked in the UK, I've worked in different countries.
How do you work in these different countries without knowing the language? How do you even listen to the radio station?
It's a really good question, especially since, I work with a lot of morning shows on music stations. So thank God those segments are 2.5 minutes long and they're easier to, to consume than a whole 3-hour talk show. But I speak Spanish, so that helps me in Spain and Mexico and, Latin America. It helps me get by in Portuguese, so I can listen to Portuguese, and sometimes I'll have to listen to something a couple of times to get it, but I can get it, and with Portuguese. Somebody helps me translate in French. Somebody definitely helps me translate in Greek, because I know about 2 words in Greek, and that's how I get by. So for example, this week I'm going to be listening to a show from Greece, and I have a translator. And so we listen together, and she tells me what they're saying. And she's great, because she's not like a human Google Translate where she just tells me the words. She'll tell me the meaning. She'll say like, he's being sarcastic here because he's saying this, but he really means this. And that's the kind of nuance I need. My consulting started in the early 90s when I was at KFI, and I was still a pretty new program director at KFI. The company that I was working for, Cox Broadcasting, became an investor in the first commercial radio in Poland after communism. So radio in Poland was all state radio during communism, of course, and just like it is now in Russia. And when communism ended in Poland, they auctioned off radio licenses, so just like in the United States, they could become commercial and businesses run them instead of the state. So they decided they wanted this radio station. They wanted to put on a spoken word radio station in Poland right after communism. And they wanted it to somehow sound like KFI. And so they came to get me. So it was within the company. So it was certainly with the permission of my company. I started consulting, and we launched this news and opinion radio station right after communism, which, by the way, is still there and #1 to this day in Poland. Yeah. But it was an amazing adventure, because right after communism, the people working there were still very much the way they had been during communism.
Sure.
So like, Mr. Hall, we understand that we would love to be able to express an opinion about the government, but you have to understand when you do that, that's when you disappear, and your kids disappear, and
Well, besides that, how do you teach somebody to have an opinion?
Yeah, exactly.
If they never. So
that's what my role was. Yeah. Yeah. And I have to tell you, this is a great story. I have to tell you, and to this day, it's one of the coolest things I've done in my whole career. I was so proud of those guys, because the very first meeting we had was exactly what you just said. It was my thinking, oh my God, how am I going to get these guys to actually find an opinion to express? Because they had come from a society where even if you have an opinion, you bury it. So you don't even show it on your face, right?
I would imagine that you would become ashamed of having a political thought.
Exactly. So that's where we started. Just 2 years later, I'm still working with them. The station is now, we have like a full lineup. We're on our way. We're zooming up in the ratings. We're doing very well. The second president of Poland, the first guy was Lech Wałęsa, the Solidarity guy. The guy who replaced him, Szczewnewski was his name, was running for re-election. And this was the first time since communism that there had been a second free election or a re-election of a president, because I think Lech Wałęsa was just there for one term. So this guy's running for re-election. He's he's saying some stupid things in the press because he doesn't know what he's doing, and politics is brand new there, and campaigning is brand new, and there aren't handlers, helping his every word. So he says some stupid things in the press, and he freaks out a little bit, and so he pulls way back from the press. So there's this period of time where he's campaigning, basically running for re-election, and silent in the media because he's too afraid to say anything. So the story in the country becomes our president is hiding from us because he's not saying anything publicly, right? So the radio station, and this was not my idea, this was their idea, the same people who said, well, Mr. Hall, if we give an opinion, they will kill us. 2 years later, they rented this great big flatbed truck. They put this concert, size sound system, huge speakers on the back of the truck, big banner with the radio station logo, of course, parked it right underneath his office. I think he was like in a third floor office. So they parked it right on the street, speakers aimed up at his office. They blasted the radio station at the building in his office. And they went on the radio and said, okay, so he's been hiding from you, but we found him and we can guarantee you that he can hear you now. So anything you want to tell him,
to do.
anything you want him to hear, please call us right now. And we guarantee he is listening to you right now.
That's fantastic.
And people did. And they weren't mean. They weren't, they were very courteous. They're like, oh, Mr. President, blah, blah, blah. And they would say whatever their things were. And then the front page of the newspaper the next day, in the national paper in Poland, like the whole front, the top of the fold, was this picture of our truck with our banner, the window, and he's looking down through the window holding a telephone like he's telling somebody, get these guys the hell out of here, whatever. But that was the picture in the paper the next day. So I'm very, very proud of how far those guys came. And that was my very first experience consulting, and I've been doing it ever since.
For people like your daughter who don't know what live and local is all about, that is the perfect example of live and local, the power of radio, the excitement, whatever's happening on the radio takes fire. The entire community stops whatever they're doing to listen and get involved in it. Yeah, and that's the thing that's becoming history in the business. And I guess there's no way to change that. And I don't think that there's anything that can be done in the way of podcasting. Before we move into that, though, are you aware the story you just told from Poland, Free Poland? Are you aware of the movement that's going on now in Kyiv, Ukraine? We're recording this. We're talking about this on November 3rd, 2022 right now. And I had a recent conversation on KLIF with my partner, Amy Shadrop, with an American author who wrote a book called Does Putin Have to Die? And the second part of the title was how Russia becomes a democracy after losing the war to Ukraine.
Wow.
And it was written that this author was writing, he wrote it with a former member of the Russian Duma. His name is Ilya Ponomarev. And Ilya Ponomarev is a true Russian patriot, but he was exiled. He was forced to flee Russia after he was the only member of the parliament in 2014 to vote against the annexation of Crimea. He's totally anti-Putin. Putin and his people forced him into fleeing, and he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of others that did too. So I'm only mentioning this because this is going to become a big thing, and I don't know why it isn't yet, but tomorrow, these exiled Russian members of parliament are meeting in Warsaw, and they're holding what amounts to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. Wow. They're putting together the framework for what they call a parallel parliament. They're going to sit down and write a brand new constitution for a free and democratic Russia for whenever Putin is killed or he's run out of the Kremlin. And they're going to be ready to move in and put this together. And the really ingenious part about it, this is why I'm so excited about it. You probably should have to edit it by the time I finish talking with you, but because it has nothing to do with anything else. But the genius part about it is that what they're going to say in this Constitution is, first, we're going to put together a temporary government, federal government for Russia. And there is a set amount of time. These people, the president or whatever they're going to call him, and the other members of the delegation will have a set period of time, probably 2 years, in which to finish framing the Constitution, setting up free elections, and really, truly free elections. And then at the end of their 2-year period, they're out. And they can never, ever go back into politics or be elected to any kind of office in Russia.
That's great. So you have
they
to do
have
it.
Nothing to gain.
Yeah.
All they're doing is working for the freedom of Russia and to create the next great world democracy.
That's exactly what George Washington did, isn't it?
Yeah.
Instead of trying to stay on and, that's exactly what he did. He was really the first guy to go, okay, this is it. It's got to be somebody else, and it's got to be peaceful, and it's either going to work that way or it's not going to work. So that's really cool that they're doing it that way.
It's a tremendous undertaking, of course, and there are huge hurdles to clear. But these are people who know their country, and they know the people in the right positions, and there's a lot of intrigue. So
wow, that's really cool.
I'm hoping that becomes huge.
Yep.
So anyway. Now, one of the other, I remember one story you told me while you were, I was kind of disappointed just a minute ago. You rattled off the countries that you're working. You're not going to Sweden anymore, huh?
No, I have. I used to have a client there. We launched actually the first commercial news talk station to compete with state radio in Sweden a few years ago, but I'm not working there now.
Yeah, you told me a story about going there. You were working there in Sweden, and I think you went out to dinner with a bunch of the people from the radio station. You remember the story? You had a
no,
had some wine. Yeah.
No, I don't remember. You might have to tell the story.
You said you had just enough wine to loosen up your tongue a little bit, and you're looking around at everybody there, and you said, "See, now you do remember, right?"
Yeah.
You said, "Do you people know how beautiful you are?" Right?
Yeah, I remember that story.
Scandinavians.
Yeah.
And didn't you tell me they said, "Well, yes.
Yeah.
We know."
Yeah. The what was he? He wasn't the morning guy. I think he was the afternoon host. And this is a radio host, right? And as we both know, and you can tell anybody who's looking at this video, people in radio, there's a reason why we're in radio and not on television, right?
We don't like cameras.
Exactly.
Right.
So this guy's a radio host. And so I make this comment and everyone kind of laughs. And he says, "Oh, we've been made aware." we're made aware. And I thought, I wonder how that works, but I didn't ask.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What have you learned about life on planet Earth with your widespread experiences? I'm going to guess that it's basically that people are the same everywhere.
Well, I can answer that a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the most valuable things that I get from the work I do internationally, and especially with the spoken word, the news talk stations that I work with internationally, because they're all talking about, world issues and current events and all that, is I've really been able to see how the United States, what the size of the image of the United States is outside of the United States, and how we're seen and how that changes over time. Because you cannot get that sense at all, of course, when you live here, right? We're the greatest thing ever, and but when you're in Europe or you're in Latin America and you see the way that people look at the United States, it's really eye-opening. And so just personally, I think that's one of the most valuable things that I get from my work is that more nuanced view of who we are in the United States as Americans and how we're seen and how the things that we do impact people. And sometimes we know it and sometimes we don't know it.
I think that's something that all Americans want to know. How are we viewed? And I'm sure it'd be a generalization because you could go around each different country and find minor differences. I
can tell you one thing overall. I'll tell you two things actually overall. One is we really are seen as arrogant, and we really are seen as we don't really know the damage we do. And most people outside of the United States think we don't care about the damage we do, which is actually probably true to a large degree when we do something that impacts other countries. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's something that's very present when you're out with people who live outside of the United States looking at, what we do. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I'll use an example or an analog, healthcare. When the Obamacare debate was going on here is when I was working in Sweden and I was in Denmark and I was doing some work in Norway, right? And so when you're in the US, those are the socialist countries and, that's like the worst it can get, right? And one day I was in Sweden and I had pink eye. So I had to find first of all, I had to find an ophthalmologist who would accept money because in their system, there is no money for healthcare. It's all, nationalized, right? And so there is no money for healthcare. And so I found this doctor who agreed to accept, 50 euros or whatever, 50 kroner or 100 kroner, whatever it was. So I go in and she looks at my eye and she says, yeah, that's conjunctivitis. So here, I'm going to give you this and this. No prescription. She just had it. So I'm going to give you Baxitraxin. I'm going to give, whatever. And then she goes, and so you've paid me for a 60-minute appointment and we've got about another 57 minutes left of the appointment. And I said, I've just spent more time with you than I do with my own doctor in any visit that I ever have. At 3 minutes, I've spent more time with you. I can't imagine what we would do for the next 57 minutes. And she said, well, you've paid for it. So, and what I realized, and again, this is not an opinion for or against, healthcare, whatever, but this is this observation that I had. What I realized is there is a layer of worry that we have in the United States. If you get cancer, if you get the wrong kind of cancer, if you have the wrong kind of accident, if you don't have insurance and you get cancer or an accident or a heart attack or whatever, and you go bankrupt and you lose everything just trying to pay the medical bills and all that. There's a film of worry that I think we all have in the background about you don't want to get sick because you're not going to be able to afford it. You don't want to have a catastrophic accident. If you do, you better hope you die because otherwise you're not going to be able to afford it. That they don't have. That whole worry just does not exist in most countries in Europe, especially in Scandinavia. It's just not, you have a heart attack, you go into the system, you get great care, they help you survive, you go on to live another 50 years. It's not like you do that here, except you go bankrupt in the process, And so...
How's it paid for?
Taxes.
Yeah.
But here's, and I don't mean this to be a, political thing, and here's the thing about the taxes. They pay more income tax than we do because it has to cover that. And it also covers universities. So, we have almost free junior colleges and they have almost free or completely free universities, like big 4-year prestigious universities and postgraduate degrees and all that. So they pay more in income tax. But one day I was sitting probably over a beer or 4 with, a talk show host in Sweden, and we decided to add up the taxes. So they pay more in income tax, but then I pay more in property tax. I don't think they pay property tax at all. I pay more in California. I pay more in sales tax. California, I sure as hell pay more in gas tax, which I think is about 60 cents a gallon, which is why the prices in California are always higher than they are where you are in Texas or anywhere else. And so when you add it all up, I really don't pay any more tax or less tax than they do. I just pay it differently than they do. And their taxes, of course, don't go to a huge, and necessary defense establishment, of course, because they have us and NATO or, whatever. Their taxes go to other things. But my point was, again, it's not for or against, healthcare, Obamacare or whatever. It was just to say their view of the United States is, they don't understand how this super successful, super prosperous, very imaginative, creative, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, create your own opportunity, American dream country would bankrupt people because they get the wrong illness, or people become homeless because they lose a job and then they just start to slip through the cracks. They just don't understand that. How is it possible that we can be all these things, the shining beacon on the hill, and yet on the other hand, we're third world in a way to them, they're according to their point of view because of the way that they live and the way that their system works. And that's been really interesting to see. And I've spent a lot of years now talking to people and kind of looking at it from that perspective and looking at understanding how they can think that way about us.
It's a reasonable confusion. I mean, reasonable for us if we ever stop to think about it. What is the homeless situation in other countries?
Oh, it's not nearly the same. It's in Latin America, it's pretty tough because you have a lot of immigrants going through, and there's not a lot of social net, no social security. So you become disabled and you can't work. You can't work, but there's no disability, SSI. What do they call the disability here? It's Social Security. There's none of that. There's no long-term disability insurance. So when you can't work, you just end up on the street begging. So there's a lot of that in Latin America. Very little homelessness in Europe. I think there's some. And this is just my opinion. This could be completely wrong, but there's so little of it, but I do see it, that sometimes I think, I wonder if they choose it. So I wonder if this is a person that just has made a conscious decision to live outside of a pretty wide and pretty deep social net that seems to, capture everyone else that starts to fall through the cracks.
Yeah. Kind of off the grid, as it were.
Yeah. Like it's a conscious decision.
We know there are people like that. There are people like that in this country. And then there's the people who have mental health issues and people with drug problems and all that kind of stuff. I was just curious if all that exists in other countries as well, or if they have programs and systems for taking care of those people.
They have more programs than we do. Especially in Europe, they have more programs than we do.
So, excuse me. All things considered, how many companies are you working with? Do you have a limit?
Right now I'm working with 10. I try to keep it to about 10. But there's always somebody who's, I've kind of done everything I can do with them, or they have, they're worried about their budget or whatever. And so they move on, or I move on, and then there's somebody else that comes along, but I try to keep it to about 10.
Are you still a one-man operation essentially, right?
No, I have one full-time assistant and 2 part-time people who help me operate this business. There's no way I could do this by myself.
Well, I know you used to have somebody that wound up working with us in Los Angeles at CBS. I can see her and I can't think of her name. Lily?
Yeah, Lily.
You said that she made the trains run on time.
Yep, exactly.
So I guess you've got that kind of, but you don't have pardon me?
I still have that. I still have, not her anymore, but I have a full-time person who does that for me.
Yeah.
Thank God. And it saved my life every day. Yeah.
No kidding. I'm sure. So, but you're not taking on partners or anybody that would be, and I'm not applying. I don't want a job.
Oh, you'd be great.
No, I don't want a job. There was a time when I wanted to do that, but that's past. But no, I mean, you're not going to expand into some big agency.
No, I don't think so. A few years ago when I first started the business, I had these big hopes of, scaling, I guess is really the word, right? Scaling up and turning it into something that I could sell someday. And, I think at this point in my career and at my age and with the work that I'm doing, and I love the work I'm doing and I love the clients that I have, which is one great thing about consulting is they have to like me or they're sure as hell not going to pay me. And I have to like them or I won't work with them. I don't need to work with them. I don't, it's not like a radio job or any job where I need the job, even though I hate the boss. So that's a really cool thing about it. But yeah, there was a few years ago, I was thinking about, man, how do I create a big thing out of this? And now I it is what it is. And this is my business.
You would wind up nothing but managing your company. You wouldn't be doing the consulting work, right?
Yeah. And I like doing the consulting work, of course. So, yeah. And in fact, this is terrible. This is terrible about the way I manage the product of my business, which is the consulting versus the business itself is, sometimes I'm going so fast and I'm so passionate about the work I do. I'll come back and I will totally forget to send a client an expense report after a trip. Just totally forget because I just go on to the next thing. And I'm so excited. I come, it's a really productive trip and I've really reached people and we did some great coaching. And, the day I leave, the radio station sounds noticeably better because of my visit. And I'm really proud of that and I'm really motivated by that. And I'm really energized by that. And then I just go right to the next thing. And then a month later I go, wait a second. I never, that's how I manage my business sometimes.
Where's your assistant?
I'm better at it, but yeah.
You need to turn that stuff over to your assistant the minute you get back.
Yeah. That's what I've started doing.
Is that right?
Yeah. For just that reason. Yeah.
We come back to where we started. Passion.
Yeah.
The love of the business, which you developed as a child. I did too, about age 8. but I didn't. And when I was 12, I was going into Croy Radio, but it was downtown Sacramento at the time, upstairs above the Country Made. And I would be able to sit there and watch the disc jockeys through the glass. And man, oh man, I'm going, yeah, I got to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, it goes.
And when did you start? How did you cross that line?
When I was in high school at Highlands High School in Sacramento, we had, do you remember Gil Krause?
I do, very well.
Gil Krause was working at KCRA radio. He had a little talk show. He had a teenage talk show, and he came out to our school and did a speech for the student body. And I think he was just he was recruiting guests. He would have he do like a 2-hour show. I'm trying to think of it as Inline. That's what it was, the Inline, because you were in, man. And so he would have teenage guests and teenage callers talking about teenage things. Kind of a really cornball idea now, but this was the 1960s, you know, so it was cool. So he came out and talked, and I came right down off the bleachers at the end, and I went and introduced myself, and I said, I want to do that. I want to come down and see you work. I would like to be on your show. And he invited me, and I did. And after that, I went into my senior year, and when I got out of my senior year, he had lined up a job for me at KCTC, just threading tapes and stuff, the automated radio station.
And that was one of the big stations in Sacramento at that time.
Yeah.
Beautiful music on KCTC.
So I got my first job straight out of high school. I was 17. But man, you started at 12.
Only because at Croy, they had no human relations department at that radio station. So they didn't care about giving me an internship for college credit when I was 12 years old.
I tell you what, it's a fun thing when people our age still love what they do.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I have a question for you, because I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, and this is supposed to be a conversation.
I don't like to think of these as interviews. I like to think of these conversations, and this is the first one that truly is just a conversation. Okay,
good. So I have a question for you. You, more than anyone I've ever heard or worked with, okay, you are able to tell a story, tell a news story. So a current news story where you actually have to keep track of facts, not just a story like a human interest story, whatever, but with warmth and giving a little bit of hope, I guess, with a spark in your eye, which is a term I use all the time in my work, and I have never been able to successfully translate. But my mom used to say that when I was a kid, and you have that. You have a spark in your eye. I talked to you about that when we were working together in Los Angeles at KNX. How did that happen? Did you start that way? Or did you start painting in the lines and doing it the way you're supposed to do it and reading the liner cards the way they're supposed to be read, and then somehow, like the little Forrest Gump in the movie, the brackets fell off and you just took off and started running? How did you get to this point where you can tell stories and you can talk about some of the most serious things that are going on in this world, and yet leave me with a little warmth and a little hope at the end of it? Because nobody does that like you do.
That's very nice of you to say. And you have said that before, so that's why we're talking now. I wanted to hear it again. No, I don't know the answer to the question. I can tell you this. Number one, my mother was she was a happy person, and she filled me with enthusiasm for each day. Very ironic, because in her own life, she was largely depressed, very sad very often, but she wrapped herself in the life of her kids, and she made us people that she was having trouble trying to be. So, I mean, the thing that I could remember more than anything, if people would say, what do you remember most about your mother? I would say she would tell me, this can be a good day or a bad day. It's entirely up to you. And she made me appreciate the little good things in life, So I tried to carry that forward. But it's funny what you were talking about, and you used that phrase, a sparkle in your eye or something. I met the great Paul Harvey one time in Sacramento, and we were at KFVK, and he came in to give a speech, one of his talks in big auditorium, the Memorial Auditorium, and we were hosting. So there was a reception for him at the hotel, and I was in there, and I was doing the morning show. So the idea was I was supposed to corner Paul Harvey and get him on the phone to talk with the people on the air at the time. Mm-hmm. So I did that. I did it with the help of my wife, Carol Ann, because I looked at Paul Harvey across the room and I just couldn't believe it. It's like, that's Paul freaking Harvey right there. I recognize his voice, and he's talking so warm, and you talk about just being effusively optimistic and having a great view of life and people and all that stuff. And a lot of it came from that influence because I played Paul Harvey on the air every single day. I did it at Croy, when I was doing the morning show. Yeah, we were running
on a top 40 station.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then later on at KCRA and then KGNR. I mean, it was like Paul Harvey was part of my life. When I was working at KGNR, besides doing the morning show, I also did the noon news, from noon until 1 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And Paul Harvey was 20 minutes of that.
Yeah.
So I think that's, he influenced my desire to tell stories in the same way. Mm-hmm. I would never compare myself to Paul Harvey, but I would, to answer your question, I think that's probably where it came from. And I never thought about it until just now.
That's very interesting. You will completely shoot this down, but I will compare you to Paul Harvey. You might not, but I certainly would compare you to Paul Harvey. So feel free to just shoot that down, but I'm just going to say that. And I wish I could mute your microphone there, but I can't.
I had, an opportunity. I'm trying to remember if it was in Dallas. No, I think it was in Sacramento. I think it was at KFPK. And Paul Harvey was still alive and he was still doing his shows. And there was one time, he always had fill-ins if he took time off and what have you. And somebody called from the network and wanted to know if I was interested in filling in for him. I said, oh, yes, of course. Please. Okay, we'll get back to you. Never did. They never got back to me.
Man, big mistake on their part. Big mistake on their part. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
You asked me about how I transitioned from working in music and playing records to doing news. How did that happen for you? So you're a top 40 DJ at Croy. I used to listen to you on Croy, and I know how much of a DJ you really were. You were the fast talking. You did all the things you were supposed to do, and the 10-second intros to songs and all that. Yeah. And then you ended up doing the morning news at KCRA, which at the time was the big news talk station in Sacramento. Right. How did you make that transition from when you played your last record to when you were doing news and talk in the morning?
Well, from Sacramento, I went from Croy. I went to Los Angeles when I was 21, and
just same as me.
Yeah, I was same age. I was programming K-Earth
at 21.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. And here I was feeling good telling you I was programming KFI at 22.
They were an automated oldies station at the time. Yeah. They were playing all 50s music at the time because this was 1972, 73.
Wow.
And the oldies were 50s. You couldn't go back any farther or you'd be in your parents' hit parade shows. Right. So I was program director of that station at 21. They were the number 7 station in Los Angeles. It was a big deal, but then from there, I went to Memphis with the same company, RKO.
WHPQ in Memphis, the big top 40 station. Wow.
WHPQ. I was program director there, did the midday show.
And how old were you when you were programming WHPQ?
Pardon me?
How old were you when you were programming WHPQ? 23,
I want to say
maybe?
22, 23, something like that. I didn't stay in Los Angeles very long. I wanted to get back on the air. I wanted to do live radio, not automated radio, but it was still a great opportunity for me. And then when I came back to Sacramento after I left Memphis, I started working at KCTC and doing commercials. KCTC was owned by the same company as KCRA. We're in the same building, and started doing a lot of commercial work. And I became a production director doing commercials. And one day, and I'd been there for several years, and for some reason, nobody in that station had any clue that I had ever been on the air anywhere. I was just, just a guy doing commercials. And they had something happened where one day at KCRA radio, which is all the news talk stations, you said, they ran into a situation where they didn't have anybody at all to do the morning show. guy was sick, somebody else was sick, one thing or another. And the program director, Dave Kleinbart, he went by the name of Dave Darren. He came to me and he says, you are on the air, right? At Croy or something. I said, yeah. He says, we're in an absolutely desperate situation. Have you ever done any news? I said, well, I can read, So they threw me on there, and one thing led to another, and I wound up being moved into the news department out of the production department. So it wasn't something I ever wanted to do. I never wanted to be a newsman. I never wanted to be a journalist. I kind of cringe if people use that word, because most of the people in radio who do news, and I'm going to insult people here, that I don't mean to do that, but most of those people are simply rewriting newspapers and, calling themselves journalists.
Yeah.
And, and in my view, it's just, I say, what, we're just storytellers. We're the town criers of this century. That's all. We're just.
Maybe this answers the other question that I asked you about. How is it that you can talk about some of the most serious things going on in the world in a way where you're not reading and you leave us with a sense of hope and all of that? And maybe it's because, first and foremost, and actually just like Rush Limbaugh, who used to say the same thing, you're not a journalist. You're the first to admit you're not a journalist as you're telling me that story. You're a storyteller telling me that story. Maybe that's the part of the answer to that question that I asked you. You don't see yourself as journalist. You don't see yourself as super serious. You have to see yourself as credible, I imagine, and you have to tell the story in a credible way so that I believe, the facts that you're passing to me. But it's because as you open the microphone and you start that story, you're a storyteller first and not a journalist first. Maybe, David, that's what makes all the difference in the world about how you are, why you are the way you are, and how you've been so successful with this style that you have.
It's very, very important to me on the air that I will tell you what I think about something, but I will not tell you how you should think about something. And I make it very, very clear that when you come right down to it, I don't know diddly squat about much of anything. My father told me something when I was about 14. It really kind of blew my chance at a big career in talk radio, because he said, people say you have a right to your opinion. He said, that's only half right. He said, you have a right to an informed opinion. And if you don't know what you're talking about, you should shut the hell up. Well, that carried that, during the O.J. Simpson trial, people was absolutely, completely, thoroughly convinced to this day that he killed his wife. I would go, it's a good thing that I'm not a juror, because I would have to say, how am I supposed to know? I wasn't there. I wasn't on the porch. I didn't, and they say, well, beyond a reasonable doubt. What is that? A reasonable doubt? I don't know that, I don't know that it's here in Dallas this morning. I don't know that it's a cloudy day. I mean, it's a cloudy day, but I don't know if I'm making any sense at all. I know that at this point in this society, you can't believe anything you read, and almost none of what you can see or hear, because there are so many people that are, making everything muddy. And I just think it's important to me that somehow that come across and say, well, you know what? I don't know what I'm talking about, but here's what I think is the situation. You decide for yourself.
Yeah, and that works.
I'm kind of
that's
really
what makes you
rambling
unique.
Here. You have
that's what makes you unique. That partly answers the question I was asking you before.
Yeah, the other part of it is I don't believe in my own ability. So which is,
I mean, there's a whole episode, and maybe involving a psychologist, just about that right there. That you, of all people, with the success that you've had and all these places you just named that you've worked at and all the things that you've done to, you don't believe in your ability.
Yeah. My wife says that I'm afraid of success. I don't even know what that means, but I don't know. I'm happy. A good life. I like it.
No, I know. You love what you do.
Huh?
You love what you do. And sometimes you do what you do in a vacuum where you get no feedback or direction from anybody around you in these different places that you've worked. And yet you still show up every day and love what you do. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you, man. This has been great. This is easy. We could do this every day.
We could do this every day. I really appreciate this conversation. It's great to talk to you, and it's great to share these stories with you. And it's great to actually finally learn some of how you are the way you are in your own experience. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. You're asking questions nobody ever asked. We're having discussions about the business that nobody ever has anymore. All right, let's do it. Let's go by, and we'll talk again soon. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you, David.
Thank you, my friend.